Another month, another inflation record beat. What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. Tuesday, the inflation numbers came out for June, which reported the largest jump in inflation in 13 years. And in case that sounds familiar, yep, we've been breaking records left and right here. On top of that, it was higher than expectations. Despite this jump in inflation, markets pretty much couldn't care less. Major news outlets basically shrugged. And it looks like this is because the narrative that this inflation is transitory is gaining steam. So what I'm going to show you today is that even if we take them at their word and this inflation is transitory, it doesn't matter. Prices are permanently higher. Ready? Let's dive in. So on Tuesday, the reports for the June inflation numbers came out and showed that inflation rose 5.4% year over year in June this year from June last year, and they rose 0.9% month over month from May of this year to June of this year. And nobody seemed to care because they looked at the data and said, hey, well, look, it doesn't really matter because guess what? Most of this inflation just came from used cars. Now, here's the deal. No inflation metric is perfect. The CPI is almost certainly understated because it overdoes the amount of quality adjustment, meaning that when things improve in quality, any rise in price of those items is discounted in the CPI. And it's also probably true that some of the private statistics out there on what the true inflation is, those are probably overstated. But regardless of what method you're using to measure inflation, you can't just shrug off a number and say, hey, well, inflation rose because this one part of my inflation metric rose a lot. Well, yeah, that's why you're measuring it. People still bought those cars and still paid higher prices for them. But the thinking is that the prices of cars, specifically used cars, rose due to supply chain issues, which are viewed largely as being transitory and due to COVID having nothing to do with the supply of money increasing. And while supply chain issues might have had an impact, it's not the main driver. Long-term, broad money supply growth is the tightest correlating factor to inflation. If we take a look at a couple of charts, we're going to first look at the United States. This is a chart of the 5-year broad money per capita growth is the blue line, and the orange line is the 5-year CPI growth in the US since 1875. And you can see here, they're very tightly correlated. If we look at the UK from 1875 until present, again, same story. Broad money per capita growth is very tightly correlated with CPI growth. Same thing in Japan and same thing in Australia. And it's important to note here what happened in Japan because people always look at Japan and say they printed a ton of money and they never had inflation. So just because we're printing a ton of money doesn't mean that was what's causing inflation or is going to result in more inflation down the road. And that narrative is completely false because it's the broad money supply growth that impacts inflation, not base money. And in Japan specifically, over the last couple of decades, while the central bank has been printing base money, the private sector and individuals have been deleveraging, saving, and national exports have been increasing, resulting in a very flat, very slow broad money supply growth. Their broad money supply has increased at a far slower pace compared to other countries like the United States, which explains why they haven't seen the same inflation. So blaming supply chain issues ignores the record money supply growth that the United States has seen over the past year and a half. And that's what's really driving the inflation that's happening right now. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they're right. Let's say that this current jump in inflation that we're seeing right now, let's say it is transitory. What exactly is it that they are saying is transitory? Not absolute inflation. The inflation rate is what they're saying is transitory. So let's say inflation is 5% right now, and let's say it's transitory and it goes back down to 2% in a couple of months. In rate of change terms, this is transitory. In absolute terms, it means prices are still rising, they're just rising more slowly than they were during these months. It doesn't mean prices are going to go back down. Let's consider the mechanics. We've had a massive increase in the total supply of broad money. That broad money is absorbed into the system, and different items, assets, goods, services absorb that new money and experience price rises at different rates and at different times. On net, across the economy, the general level of prices increases as it absorbs the influx of all of that new money. At that point, if the broad money supply completely stops growing and levels off and plateaus, prices would eventually settle at a permanently higher plateau, but they would not come back down. You wouldn't see deflation. So it's not absolute inflation that they're saying is transitory, it is the rate of change. And we can look back at history and see that this is exactly what has happened before. If we take a look at this chart, which by the way, all these charts that I'm showing are from a recent article by Lynn Alden on lynnalden.com. I'll have that great article linked in the description below. But this chart shows the inflation rate. Obviously, we have three giant spikes in inflation, one in the early 40s, one in the late 40s, and then one in the early 50s. The following drops in the inflation rate, this is key here, is not deflation, it's disinflation. It's still inflation, it's still prices generally moving up, they're just moving at a slower pace than they were before. If we take a look at this second chart that shows inflation in absolute terms instead of rate of change terms, you can see exactly what we're talking about here. There's a big jump in prices, they level off. A big jump in prices, they level off. Again, no deflation, the economy absorbs the influx of new money that has come into the system. If we take a look back at this chart, which shows all of the new money that was created corresponded with the jumps in the inflation rate. So the economy absorbs that new money that's been created. The inflation rate jumps up. The absolute price level rises, and as the broad money supply growth settles down, so do the prices, but this is again the key that I need to drive home. They don't come back down. You don't see broad deflation because nobody's sucking that money back out of the system ever. It's not going to happen. Further than that, there's absolutely no evidence that suggests the broad money supply growth will stop, because there are two ways that the broad money supply grows. One of them is bank lending, and the other one is large fiscal deficits monetized by the central bank. Usually, bank lending leads the way because when banks lend money, they're actually loaning dollars into existence. So as new loans are created, every time you swipe your credit card, the money supply grows just a tad bit. Now, deflationistas have gotten some big airtime recently because bank lending over the last year and a half has basically ground to a halt. But the last year and a half has also shown that what the central planners want, the central planners get. And if they want a drastic increase in the supply of money, you don't need the banks. You can just go around them, run large fiscal deficits that are monetized by the central bank. And in other words, that means the government spends more money in excess of both what it taxes and in excess of what it borrows from the economy, and everything else it has to borrow is borrowed from the central bank printer. This injects new money into the system, which grows the total supply of money. And as the trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending starts to gain steam, we're going to continue to see these large fiscal deficits that are again going to be monetized by the central bank. And coincidentally, this is money that is going to be spent directly on things like commodities and raw materials and labor, contributing directly to increasing prices. So if bank lending continues to decline, it doesn't matter. But since it's basically as low as it can go, if bank lending does start to increase from here, that's only going to contribute even more towards the broad money supply growth, which again contributes more towards inflation. So in summary, it does not look to me like the current inflation numbers are going to significantly decline anytime soon here, because prices are a reaction to the broad money supply growing. But even if the broad money supply stops growing and flattens out, and then as a consequence, if prices stabilize and stop growing, that doesn't mean they're gonna start to fall. That just means they've absorbed the new money that entered the system. It doesn't mean we're gonna get deflation. So next time you hear a fiat shill say that inflation is transitory, just remember that that only means that prices are going to continue to rise, just more slowly, not that they're headed back down. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.